Number 4. That's a little crazy.
That's crazy, crazy.
That's her idea, I assume?
Yes.
Okay, Fort Hayes, we're going to get started.
Okay.
All right. To all of you that are here, I am Sarah Velasquez, the communications coordinator for the K-INBRE. Most of you probably know me. If you don't, hello. We are going to have an interesting discussion about diversity today, and I will let our presenters introduce themselves so I don't get anything wrong.
That's fine.
And remember that we have social media that you can connect with us on, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We have a website. We post all of the discussions videos on the website. So if your students are unavailable now, then they can go and watch it later. So we have all the old ones on there if you missed any of them. And also join us on LinkedIn. So I will let you get started.
Yeah. So I'll introduce myself. I'm Dr. Kimathi Choma. I'm the Assistant Dean for Diversity, Recruitment, and Retention in the College of Arts and Sciences. And biology here at Kansas State is housed in the College of Arts and Sciences. So after an event here at Kansas State dealing with race and ethnicity, and a young lady putting some pictures on K-State's, putting on a Snapchat, and then it went viral across the United States, we've been having more conversations about diversity. And so I was invited to come talk to you all about diversity, about race. And so I called in some colleagues, because you never want to do something like this alone. You always want to bring in other people that have ideas so that we can all have a general conversation about diversity, about race and racism. And I want to let you know this is a safe place. So you have an opportunity to share your ideas. There'll be no judgment. We're going to learn and grow together as we have these conversations. So I first like to bring up my colleagues, those that are with me, so that they can introduce themselves too, because we're going to be doing this collaboratively. And we'll try and look in your right direction.
Yep. Okay, I'll go first. Hi, you guys. I'm Emily Worley. I'm a junior this year at K-State, and I'm a biology pre-med major, and I'm just pretty intimately involved in diversity on campus. I do our diversity committee for College of Arts and Sciences. I'm also planning our student diversity summit. I've done that for a couple of years now.
My name is Ted Morgan. I'm an associate professor in biology, and my role in being here is that in the community of Manhattan, I've worked for a long time on diversity issues, and after the incident that Kimathi was talking about that went viral on social media, I met Kimathi at an event organized by the Black Student Union, and after that event, I got involved in the Arts and Sciences Diversity Committee, and I'm now a member of that committee, and so Kimathi and I talk frequently about diversity issues, and that's sort of how I've ended up in this room to
talk to you today about diversity, race, and racism. So I do need a show of hands, or just so we know where we are, how many people watched the video? And it's okay if you didn't, I just want a context. Okay, so everybody in this room, how many people in your rooms were able and had time to watch the video? Okay, we see some hands. Okay, that's good. So the video will be the context in which we're going to have this conversation on So Dr. Camara Jones, and she was at one time the president of the American Public Health Association. So I didn't actually see it live, but it was a great video that she did. It was really a TED Talk. It was allegories on race and racism. So from those, we're going to use that as the context, because I think that sometimes we have difficulty in America talking about race and racism, but she does a great job of putting things in an allegorical way that helps us with beginning these conversations. So I first want to start out, we talked about who to watch the video, everybody in this room had, and some people in the other sites have, so that's great. What were your thoughts? Let's talk about some of the allegories, and I'll name them for you so we can kind of go in order, because I think it's kind of important to go in order. So the first allegory that she talked about was the lanterns. Would anybody want to give some feedback or some thoughts about that? Now, what did you think? Yeah.
Well, so the concept is that we much prefer to be with like right? So
Yes.
being this, race, being a gender, being a, anything, like is more comfortable because we have the idea that we know how to talk to each other.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, we really like to be around, or we're most comfortable around people that we look like. Okay, so that's an excellent observation from that video. Can we hear them? Okay, yeah. Is there any feedback from people in at the other sites about their thoughts about that, Japanese lantern analogy? There were many hands. Okay, so one thing that she went through was how we define race. And race is a social construct, not a biological descriptor. Okay, so, one thing, we may see each other looking differently, but there's not one trait that's solely, let's say, in African Americans that aren't in other groups of people. And sometimes how we define race can be wrong. It's more social, emotional construct than a biological construct. And that's the point that she was trying to get through this analogy, where based on a particular culture or in a particular light, things look differently. She said in South Africa, being an African American, she's a light-skinned African American, she was viewed maybe as colored. Or in another setting, she was viewed as white because she was a light-skinned African American, what we would consider light-skinned African American. So these definitions of race have evolved over time. So that's something that you want to think about. It's not consistent throughout the whole world, and it's not even consistent throughout the United States. How people have been viewed, Caucasians or Irish weren't viewed in the same light now as just this blanket of white as they were a long time ago. So, thoughts that you had?
That's all I was going to say. I agree.
Okay. Anyone else in the room that wants to add some thoughts about that video, that first analogy that she was talking about? Because I want this more to be a discussion, because we really want to talk about, our thoughts and perspectives.
I thought it was a really good allegory. Of sort of both that we do tend to be more comfortable around people who share our views. Like we tend to hear a lot about leftist views clustering together, or right political views clustering together, and because being around something that is uncomfortable is more challenging or different. More challenging, but I think the other part that she sort of was making a point that those are artificial, they're constructs, not intrinsic, and so that they are social constructs. So I thought it was a good allegory for that. One of the things I was wondering about, I really loved all her allegories, and I won't skip ahead to the others. You're going to cover them.
We're going to cover. Can you write lantern? You can just on the paper.
But I was wondering sort of the
Japanese
sort of working in diversity, what you feel is more effective for, allegory versus fact.
Yes.
There's a marker right here.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
So I was just wondering sort of the idea of allegories versus presenting data, right? Because I really enjoyed her allegories. I thought they were very expressive. But I was just wondering, sometimes I was like, I'd love to see some of the data on this. Like, would that be at all useful as well?
Yes, I think that I think allegories are really good when you're trying to help people initially broach a difficult conversation, because you're not like hitting them between the eyes with it. You are saying, here's an allegory to help you start thinking about this race and racism. So that's a good starting point. But once you've gotten people introduced to the idea, yes, there is plenty of data about inequities here in the United States. And one thing that I want to announce that tonight, even at Kansas State, there's going to be a person speaking about minority health at 7 p.m. in the Flint Hills room. So there's a lot of data about inequities that go on solely based upon race, which is a social construct and not a biological construct. Okay, good. Next. So that was the first one, the Japanese lantern. And then the second allegory that she talked about was open versus closed sign. And in that allegory, there was people in a restaurant and they're sitting there eating happily, and all they can see, the restaurant is now closed. So all they can see is the open sign. On their side, they're happily eating, but everyone that's outside of the restaurant only sees a closed sign. So what this really speaks to, and I was debating whether I was going to give it away for, but access. You know, if you're in the restaurant and you are eating, you don't have the experience of those that are outside looking in. Okay. Any other thoughts? And I have some thoughts written down here, but are there any other thoughts that you all had around that allegory?
I mean, it spoke to me in terms of the inability to see the difference, right? Because I'm white, right? And so I have not experienced what it is like to be Black. Just like I was thinking about, yesterday was the day to wear a hijab, right?
Yes.
And like, what is that like? How different would people's interactions with me be? And so there's that element of you. It's very hard to project yourself into a situation in which you have not been. And so it's very easy to take for granted the position in which you are, if you are in a position of access.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because I had colleagues and friends and one of my colleagues who wore a hijab all day yesterday. And then you could change your perspective. You know, why, all these questions came to people's heads about women wearing hijabs yesterday at Kansas State. Why is she wearing that? Is there solidarity with the Muslim community? What is the whole purpose and the reason? So you might change your perspective of that person by them simply doing that. So that might be instance to show you how and I think it's really good when a person of privilege, whatever your privilege is, you take an effort to be in another situation where you're not privileged, because you may experience what people who aren't privileged in your same way experience every day. So one aspect is I'm African American and I'm a male, so I might have male privilege. I'm also heterosexual, so there's some privilege there. So there are various forms of intersectionality that we talk about that we need to sometimes go into other people's spaces and hear them, listen to them, so that we can understand their perspective. And rather than just assuming that we know, or really being humble enough to say, I've never lived what it's like to be a woman, so I don't have that perspective. But what I can be is very open to listen to when a woman says to me, this is the life that I live, and accept that definitely as fact, because I can't debate it, because I've never been a woman. Does that make sense? Yes.
So where does this, I feel like there's a fine line somewhere in there, like wearing the hijab, about like cultural appropriation, or somebody trying to experience something from a different point of view, but then being criticized for doing that.
Good point. So yes, there is a cultural appropriation, but I think the way in which you kind of go anti the cultural appropriation is getting with the people of that culture and saying, I would like to learn and grow, and then it's not cultural appropriation. So the hijab yesterday was set up by a group working with the Muslim community that said, I want to help understand your experiences. So it's not cultural appropriation if you're working with the community that's their culture. So, if we just have a day and say, okay, we're going to celebrate Mexican American heritage culture, and then we just eat tacos. That, I would say, is more the cultural appropriation. So I'm glad you brought that up. But if we get with the community and say, we want to embrace, we want to learn, it's not cultural appropriation when you invite them in or you let them lead out and say, this is how we can best celebrate my culture. Is that okay? Good.
I'd like to add something to that, which is that there's this concept that comes up frequently when you talk about cultural sensitivity and cultural competence. And the word cultural competence, I chuckle at frequently because the reality of things is that when you are trying to figure out how it is that you're best going to behave in a diverse space, you're never going to know about every culture. You're never going to know about every background that surrounds you in that space because you haven't lived in all those spaces. I'm white. You're a woman. There's diverse social experiences and life experiences that exist. But the reality is that in things that I've seen come up in training that I've participated in is the difference between cultural competence and cultural humility. And so it's what Kimathi was describing, that when you go into a space and you basically are open to listening about diverse cultures and learning, but not ever feeling as though you're competent in that culture, because your culture is your own culture. You may share that culture with other individuals, but ultimately you're never going to be completely competent in another person's social setting.
And there's a great article about cultural competence versus cultural humility that we will make sure we send out to you all so you can just read through it. Because as Dr. Morgan said, you're never competent in somebody else's culture, but you can be humble. We can care about each other. We can love one another to say, I don't fully understand your culture or will never be competent in it, but I'm humble enough to say, I still want to learn. I still want to grow. Because oftentimes, this goes back into my other point, it's difficult to recognize systems of inequality that privilege us, okay? So it may be difficult to me as an African-American male to realize how our society privileges males, okay? But I often see how, I'm quote unquote disadvantaged by being African American, or all the things that we see in our media that impacts African Americans. I mean, that's clear to me. I see it every day. I deal with it every day. But I'm unaware of other things, or how the LGBT community is impacted by the things that go on in our society that impact them. But I'm striving to be humble enough to go to particular communities and say, well, how does this impact you? I learned so much when Michelle, what's her name? HarrisPerry? Melissa, sorry, not Michelle. Melissa HarrisPerry came to K-State and talked about women and about how the female parts are politicized, So all these things I learned by listening to her experiences and how she was talking about it, as a woman, expressing her concerns, expressing how she felt, being open to hear it rather than just saying, no, that can't be true. She's being emotional or these kind of things. This is a fact for her, and she, in being open to listen to people's voices. By voices, I mean their perspective. And a lot of times we have difficulty open up these conversations and sitting down and talking to one another. I heard you take a breath.
Before we leave that point, the thing that's important in that is that it's putting yourself into spaces where, if you're in a dominant majority, that you put yourself, and then you shut up when you enter those spaces. The camera just went that way. I'll just keep talking. That you move into spaces and you listen to groups that essentially you don't talk the entire time that you're there. So white guys have a habit of just talking all the time, and so if you shut up and listen for a little while, that really helps in terms of what it is that, and if you're actually going to try and be culturally humble. It's back on us there. Yeah.
Go ahead. You're gonna write that one? Okay, go ahead. Write that one. Another point that when we were watching the video that we were thinking about is, why don't you recognize when you have privilege? Why don't you recognize privilege you don't recognize when you have privilege, but it's very apparent to those who don't have that privilege. So we have to understand that the privilege that I have, I've been this way my whole life. So I don't understand male privilege the way a woman would see it. I may not understand, being heterosexual in America or being Christian in America the way non-Christians would view that. So I have to listen to those who don't have those perspectives to understand that. Any thoughts around that? Yes, you look like you wanted to.
Yeah, I just think that the point where you said that you can realize your you can't realize your own privileges, but other people around you realize that they're not getting the same treatment. I think it's apparent that like people that have a lot of privilege just assume it's the status quo, and they don't really realize that other people are struggling. And then when you're in the position of struggling, it's like, I can clearly see this person getting a lot more advantages than me. Like, you're just more acutely aware of injustices than you are when you're in the other spot.
Yes, you can.
Okay, I just have a quick story for you guys, and that was so powerful what you just said, just because we actually had someone come in and talk to us about this. And so it was in like a very impoverished area that all these healthcare professionals, I'm gonna go to our healthcare people right now, all these healthcare professionals were getting together, and we had a really big problem with all of our newborn babies not getting the care that they needed. And so all these healthcare professionals got together and we're like, what's going on? Like after we are like giving birth to these children, we're giving them all this great instruction. We're telling them, you don't need to have them sleep with you in the bed. They need to be in their crib. You need to make sure you feed them at this time. Like we're giving them this great instruction. Why are they not listening to us? And they brought someone in who was from that community, and she said, you know what? She was like, what's the next best thing? And they were like, what are you talking about? Like they need this. Like there is no next best thing. This is what they need. And she was like, a lot of those people can't afford cribs. What's the next best thing? And it was that was so powerful because she had come from that area, and these people are doing the best that they can. Like they can't afford a crib, so they have to keep that baby there. And they were like, okay, well, swaddle the baby. Make sure that at least they can't roll around. Make sure that you try to get as much space, but what's the next best thing? And so that was so powerful. It's something that they didn't see that because they had never been in that situation, and they thought that they were helping these people out. They were giving them all this great advice, but it wasn't advice that they could use. So it's really important to keep that line of communication open to see what is really available to different populations. So yeah, that's really great.
Thank you. Another thing that we think, do you think in her analogy, that these open and closed signs exist? Let's talk about that. Do you think that there are those inequities and things are going on because not everybody views them the same way? What are your thoughts?
Yes.
Well, for some people it's a given, but for, as we talk about it, we differ in our perspective on how they exist. What's one thing that you think, about?
I mean, so one thing that I guess was more personal to me growing up was I had a very good friend who was gay, and within my family or people in kind of my immediate surroundings would sort of question their existence, like their right to be the way they are, and then I just sort of, it became a very personal sort of issue for me, because I was very troubled by that and I didn't like it, and so one time my grandma actually really impressed me because I was talking to her. She's born in the 20s, and actually earlier than that, she grew up in the 20s. And so she, I expected her kind of to have a more prejudiced attitude, as I would say, towards gay rights, like towards being able to get married, which is actually a very recent right? And seems very fundamental. And so I asked her, what she thought of that, and she said, I think it's really wrong that people are denied the same basic rights. She's like, maybe you don't call it marriage, right? But everyone deserves equal protection under the law and equal opportunity. And that's a very obvious inequity, right?
Right.
And so I was very impressed by that. Like, that she thought like fairness was a fundamental value for her, and it didn't matter that she didn't understand it, but she thought it was just there was fair, and fair is fair.
Fair is fair.
So yeah, I think there are very obvious things like that. The ones I'm more familiar with are the ones in the gay community, right? But because I haven't had as much experience in the Black community or the Muslim community, right, or other communities that we have. So, but I sort of have a tangential awareness of those same obstacles existing. So I mean, obviously the right to marry someone, that was a very obvious one for a long time, where it's a closed sign. So
yes.
I think anybody who's been in a high school cafeteria probably understands the open and closed sign.
Right.
Because there were these cliques in high school that you're not in that one, then there's something wrong, you're on the outside, but you might be in one, so then you're on the inside.
Right.
So I think it's very fluid there, but I mean, it's a perfect example of probably everybody's experience.
And I think you make an excellent point. So maybe we might not understand somebody's experience directly, but if we take that as context and put it into an experience that we had, and then we can share in some of how they felt when they were on the outside and you were on the inside. And I think it's important to sometimes help bring people into the inside. I'll tell you, a gentleman was walked up to me today. He was riding a little Apple bike, and he obviously looked like he needed some help. So from a social economic standpoint, we're both African American males, but we were in two different social economic standpoints. And this is just me looking at him, and then him asking me, would you mind buying me something to eat? Because I haven't eaten today. So we're in two different camps. I can turn away and I can say, no, oh, I'm busy. I got, talk to K-INBRE and, K-INBRE and a diversity talk in less than, an hour, and I need to finish with the notes or do whatever. Or I can say, let me share in his experience, do something to bring him. I introduced him to our union. He said, oh, wow, we took him into the union, got him something to eat. It took 20 minutes, half an hour of my time, but he got to share in my experience. We are privileged as academics to be in an academic environment. Not everybody has the money or the finances to go to college or to be a professor or to be an assistant dean or something like that. All of that is based on your socioeconomic status. And some people don't have or are not privileged in that area. And sometimes where you start can impact where you end up. Not always. I mean, there are rags to riches stories, but that's not the norm. I see a lot of heads nodding, so that's good. The next tale, let's go on there. Our next allegory was the gardener's tale.
Can I say one thing
Yes,
before we move on?
you
Just
sure can.
the point
Please
about various types of privilege is that there's all this sort of discussion about how it is that people, how it's difficult to view your own privilege, how other people view your privilege from outside the group that you're in. But there's also the responsibility as you start to have these conversations of how it is that you exercise your privilege. Because as you have privilege and as you are emerging scientists or training emerging scientists, and one of the things that I think a lot about is basically that science and academia in a lot of spaces is a very white place, and we're not doing as good a job, not just training the next generation of scientists in terms of access, but we're also not doing as good a job as we could be having diverse minds in the mix that come from diverse backgrounds. And so exercising your privilege is, and it's not a simple, here's how you do it sort of thing. But if you have it, there are spaces that you can be in where you can have these conversations where, when someone, says something that's out of line or says something that people behave differently in spaces where they're part of the group that has privilege. And when you're in those groups that have that privilege, you need to use the fact that you're in those groups to actually help move social change, because people know nowadays that it's not smart to be a racist, to be a homophobe, to express these sorts of things. But in certain groups, they'll let things slip.
Yep.
They don't do it in a manner where they think they're being sexist or racist or homophobic or whatever it might be. But it needs to be the sort of thing that when you see it, you call it out, and it's an exercise of privilege.
Yep. So I think that point is just using your privilege to help others. I mean, it's the kind, gentle, caring thing to do when you're in those spaces, to use your privilege to help others or to bring others in, or challenge. Like, we're both males, Dr. Morgan and I. If a group of males were sitting and talking around about women, I think it's important for me to say, hey, maybe we shouldn't, let's think about this differently, or bring a woman in to get her perspective on it. Because as males, we wouldn't understand that vantage point. So let's go on to The Gardener's Tale. I think just for those who hadn't seen it, it was an allegory basically about race. She had two different pots that she was growing plants in. One was very good soil, and the other was rocky soil and not good to grow plants in. She had some red seeds and some pink seeds, and she threw was it the red in the better soil? The red in the better soil and the pink in the less healthy soil. And then year after year, those plants would grow and grow. And then after a while, she said, I knew I was right to prefer the red over the pink. Look how strong and excellent the red is versus the pink. And that is an allegory about race in our society, because one group has been particularly advantaged in our society where another group may have been or has been disadvantaged. And then after time, there's been all of this saying, well, the pink are lazy or incompetent or not as smart because of the environment that has disadvantaged them, is one aspect of it. And then the other environment was very productive and supportive. So these aren't solely, and there are people who were in the disadvantage but that has excelled, and there are people in the advantage that have not excelled to the same level. But we have to understand that these are structural things in our society that impact how people perform and where they are and where they may end up. So she talked about what racism is. And she said, what is one, and every time she put race, it was in quotes. So somebody tell me why does she always put race in quotes, if you saw that? What are your thoughts? Why did she put race in quotes? Yes.
She said it at the very beginning.
Yep.
Right?
So tell us. Speak it out.
It's not biology, so the word doesn't actually exist. I mean, there's no scientific meaning for the word itself. It is, a social construct. It's a social construct, exactly. And that's what I like that she did that. So she says, what is racism? And she says it's a system of structuring opportunities and assigning value based on social interpretation of how one looks. I mean, if you just look at me as an African American, historically, in your mind, there's been a lot of things that have been associated with African Americans because of our history, through slavery, through civil rights, through current issues going on today. If you just see me walking down the street, you have some thoughts about it. They could be positive, they could be negative, but everyone has those thoughts. It's what you do with that that impacts. And she said so-called race. But the structural inequities or opportunities exist, and we have to deal with them and then work to, I think, to dismantle some of it so that everyone is equal and has the same opportunities, but then also we understand that they do exist. Any other thoughts? Because I'm going to break down her 4 different or 3 different areas of racism, but were there any thoughts about what I just said? No?
Okay.
I think something that, comes across is also this implicit bias, right? So, I mean, you talk about the different levels and,
Mhm.
I don't want
Thank
to
you.
take this away, but
No,
I think
you're
the
fine.
implicit bias that, really strikes with this allegory is that, at the end, you have like red being,
Right.
beautiful, wonderful,
Wonderful.
highly grown,
Yep.
straggly pink.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a self-fulfilling prophecy because she,
Thank you.
preferred red to begin with.
Right.
Unknowingly, I mean, not as an active process, but this implicit bias that is there that,
Right.
sort of relates to, any discrimination of course.
Yep. And implicit bias often leads to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So-
Yeah. So your biases will lead to the outcome, and then you say, "Wow, I was right to prefer that because look how it's turned out." But it's turned out that way because of your actions. Cause and effect. If you set up a particular set of scenarios and then it turns out the way you anticipated it to happen, then you say, "Oh, wow, I was right." So we kind of have to challenge some of our biases so that we don't get the results of our biases. And a lot of times that what helps is if we have some training, we have some interaction. If you aren't around a particular group of people that you need or want to know more, find a way, find spaces. At all of our universities, there are affinity groups. At K-State, there's the Black faculty and staff. Come to one of those meetings. There's Indigenous Alliance. There's the LGBT Center. So there are opportunities, especially at a college, like no other place I think on earth, to expose yourself to opportunities to interact with people that are different. I'm going to put you on right now because I think there's no better time.
Yeah, so I'm going to echo a lot of what he just said. So when I came to college, I'm from Topeka, Kansas, right? I'm from a very, very similar family set. I mean, mindset basically that regardless of who you are, where you come from, if you work hard, you're going to succeed. And you guys, I'm here to tell you that is not more false. I mean, if you come from, even just looking back in my high school, when I would go to class, when I came home, my parents would help me with my chemistry. My parents would help me with my science. And I had a really good friend who was not just excelling in those courses as much as I was, but she came home and her parents worked 2 jobs. They weren't there to help. I mean, I'm sitting here thinking, oh, I'm just working harder. I have this drive to work harder. No, that's not what it is. And so I think first step is when I came to college, realizing that. And because a lot of people, like we said, we don't realize that we do have advantages to a lot of other people. And then the next step is, you guys, all these groups, we talk a lot about how difficult and how we don't want to offend people, but I think communication is just so key, because any one of these different groups, people who are different than you, if you go up and talk to them, most of them are going to be so willing to share with you and so willing to say, come to this, like, come learn with me. And that's why I got involved in the diversity committee in my college. And when I first came and when we first heard about it, I was like, they're probably not going to want me. I'm about as wide as it gets. Like, what do I have to offer this committee? But I think it was coming and just being an advocate for people like me to come and learn about other people. That's why it's so important to just really recognize who you are, recognize your privilege, and recognize what you can get involved in and what you can assist in, and just educating people. I think that's the biggest thing that we want to tell you today, is just educate others on who other people are and what they've gone through, and look at how you can help them. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
I think that was a
Yes.
good example. You talking about your high school experience, that I don't know what high school you went to in Topeka, but I know there are different, I live in Topeka, so there are different preferred high schools, and some are more diverse than others and might have a mixture of students from a poorer area of the community going to school with students from a richer community in the same high school. And I think we have to remember that in college also, that just because we're all in a university setting together, that how you got to that setting
Correct.
is maybe extremely different from somebody else. For example, one of our institutions is Haskell, Indian Nations University. So how they got to the type of educational setting that they're in and how they got to that setting is very different from Kansas State University. So we have to remember that just because we're all in biology together,
right,
and obtaining degrees in biology and hoping to get the same types of jobs or go into the same opportunities, we didn't all come from the same backgrounds financially or
right,
from economically, any of those situations, how our parent, like you said, how our parents, you know, whether or not they work one job and they're educated, or whether or not you're a first generation college student. So just because people are in the same group of privilege as you does not mean they came from the same group.
Right. Excellent point. Let's go on to the 3 types of racism that she mentioned. The first was institutionalized racism, and it says differing access to goods, services, or opportunities of a society based on race, as she said. So really what that is, those are those structural inequities that exist in our society. We may not often be aware of them because they've come throughout history. You know, they've been institutionalized throughout history. So we're not often aware of them. You know, it's like the number of, you know, let's say African Americans here at Kansas State is impacted by the history of what goes on in America, or what has gone on in America. So there are a lot of institutionalized things that we don't think about day to day. Are there any examples that you all can think of?
Well, she linked socioeconomic status to race.
She did.
And that is not a intrinsic quality of race to be poor, right? I mean,
Right.
It's not an intrinsic
Right.
quality to be African American is to be poor.
Right.
But that the disproportional distribution that you see of wealth has to do with the historic carryover, essentially, of slavery and then Jim Crow, and then, you know, and that these things have perpetuated a system, even if some of those parts of the system, or most of them even if it's gone,
Right.
then there's still the fact that if you're poor, you don't go to college as easily, right? Or you don't, or you live in communities where crime is higher and you're more likely to be shot. Or you're more likely to get involved in crime yourself, right? Or something like that. And so that these tend to be self-perpetuating once you start from an unequal position,
Right.
that it actually can take some time or deliberate effort before that is undone. So you kind of wear the history.
You wear the history. I often think about it like if there was a race and you had 2 people starting at the same point. Okay, let's say we all started at the same point, but then you hold one person back, but then you let the other person start running. And we're now, let's say, 1 hour into the marathon. And then you ask why this person here, this person over here, why they're not at the same spot. But there were things that went on that you held them back. So how can you expect them to both be at the same spot if there were disadvantages that held this person back? So that's what's going on when we have institutionalized structures that are inequitable, okay? So maybe further down the line, so way out here, I'm trying to get those same colors right, but anyway, way out here, everything are more equal, but still one group will be behind the other because they've had a longer time to be running. So that's one way that I think about it when we're talking about, you know, institutional racism. Now, let's talk about the other aspect, which is personally mediated racism. This is when differential assumptions about the abilities, motivation, intent of a group based on or by race. So it's basically how I think about you based on your race. You're African American, so therefore maybe I think that you're not as smart as Caucasian Americans. You're African American, so you must come from this lower eco-socioeconomic class. Like when my undergraduate institution, we went to a school and it was near Philadelphia, and the professor kept saying to my wife, "Oh, you're from Philadelphia." And she said, "No, I'm not from Philadelphia." And then a week later, he would say, aren't you from Philadelphia? Because in his mind, that's where all the black people lived. She kept saying, no, I'm from New Jersey. No, I'm from New Jersey. And so we have to, change some of those biases or those thought processes that we have. And once someone tells you who they are, where they're come from, you accept that about them and you learn and grow. And once somebody says, I'm from this place, you change your paradigm. So a lot of time it's a paradigm shift for us. Another thing she quoted was differential actions based on the assumptions. So we may treat African Americans one way or treat versus a Caucasian American another way based on the assumptions that we have about them. If you see a black person, male in a hoodie or something like that, you're going to have some particular assumptions. So therefore, are you going to treat them based on that assumption? Or you see me walking down the street in my suit and tie. I don't experience a lot of the interactions with the cops in the way that maybe some of my other young black males experience, because I walk around like this in a shirt and tie. But they have different assumptions about me now because I'm a 42-year-old man versus this young person that's in a hoodie. So we need to change some of our perspectives along the way. And then there's prejudice and discrimination. So, we all can have biases, but how do we enact those biases? Does it make us prejudiced? Does it make us discriminate, or does it make us racist? And a lot of times, I saw this on a video, it says people will do racist things but hate to be called racist. It's like it's like really bad in our society. When we think racist, we think Ku Klux Klan. To be honest, raise your hand if you I say, oh, that person's racist, you think Ku Klux Klan. That's the image that even comes to my mind. But sometimes there are racist statements, racist things that go on in our society, and racist things that people say that are racist. But if you call them out about it, they're immediately going to say, I'm not racist. So we hate being called racist, but a lot of racist things we do. Any thoughts?
Yeah,
so good.
The thing with racism is basically that it needs to be, so yeah, it's not cool to be racist anymore, so people are not racist, and so, but at the same time, there's lots of racist things that happen. There's also institutionalized racism is something that's real. And for a lot of white people, institutionalized racism is a very threatening idea, because it's one of these things where it's like, I didn't do those things. It's not my fault that, that there's institutionalized racism. That's true. It's not your immediate fault that there's institutionalized racism. That said, you've benefited from the institutionalized racism that's actually there, because systems of inequity that disenfranchise groups of people advantage other groups of people. And so recognizing them and working to actually make them right is a very critical part of thinking about racism. And the thing is that people hate talking about racism, because it's one of these things where it's like, I'm not racist. We don't need to talk about this. But the reality of things is that there's lots of racism that exists in our society and in our systems that exist in the world, and they need to be discussed in a meaningful manner. So that's all I wanted to add.
So the third type of racism that she talked about was internalized racism. And this is the acceptance by the stigmatized race of the negative messages about their own abilities and intrinsic worth. So kind of the way I think about that is when, people in, let's say, ghetto, or the people in the urban areas have been, and I use those all in quotes, so forgive me, they say, okay, well, you think I'm a hood, or you think I'm this, that, and the other, I'm going to be the best at that you've ever been, rather than to come out of that and strive for, let's say, education or financial independence and things like that. So it's when people internalize the negativity that has been thought about them, and in an act of rebellion or an act of, you know, countering society's views of them, they're just like, okay, well, I'll embrace it and I'll make the most of it. If you're not gonna think of me any other way, then why don't I be the best at that I could possibly be? So that's the kind of perceptions or things that she was talking about with internalized racism. You know, I start to think that is really who I am when it's not. I saw a hand.
Well, I think it's another sort of an additional thing as well, right?
Uh-huh.
It's not just, you know, sort of, okay, you know, you want me to be the stereotype, I be the stereotype.
Right.
I think it's also the point of like, I'm trying to break out of the
Correct.
stereotype, right? Because, you know, I have the stereotype myself, right? Whatever I get, I actually don't really deserve, right?
Right.
So, you know, for women, it's called imposter syndrome, right?
Yep.
So it's like, you know, so it's, you know, so the idea, like, once you cross the privilege, so let's
Correct.
say you manage to go through that door, what
Right.
do you actually do in that door? And then, you know, so can you pull people with you through that door or through that gate or not? And so, you know, shutting up when you go to an area and actually not voice your opinions about it.
Excellent.
I guess the question I would throw back at you, so how do you actively, like the transition to this conveyor belt thing is, how do you actively make that happen? You know, so what?
Voice it.
Okay.
So one thing is to walk into a room and ask, you know, how many people here think that you're going to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you would be surprised.
Yeah,
right.
I just did this in a room full of, you know, graduate students, and every single one of them raised their hands, and
Right.
there were more white men
Sure.
than, you know, any other mixture you
Yep.
can
Yeah.
come up with,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So that was interesting.
And you make a good point. I'll be right with you. You make a good point because I think we're all feeling the same thing. But until it's voiced, we don't realize that we're all feeling the same thing. And you create spaces by you even asking that question in the beginning of that class. You look at the next person and you're like, oh, they're feeling the same thing that I'm feeling. And so therefore, then you have an opportunity to say, this person is in the same situation from an emotional standpoint that I am. They feel inadequate about being here. So we're all moving from maybe a feeling of inadequacy to a feeling of, you know, we can do this. And then there's what we need to create is the solidarity. We're all more similar than we are different, but we focus on the differences and not the similarities. We'll hear your point, and then I want you to talk about the conveyor belt, and then we're done.
Oh,
Go ahead.
well, I was just gonna say that a lot of it is also subconscious. Like, you don't realize that you don't feel like you deserve. Like, it's very hard to internalize and think, what am I actually feeling? So I just wanted to kind of add that because, like, women are, like your point that women kind of feel like they don't deserve something, and it pertains to like the conveyor belt, because what do you do to take action at that point if it is at a subconscious level? Like, how do you come out of that shell to realize that you don't deserve, like, you're feeling that way?
No, so the conveyor belt allegory was just one, which is that generally speaking, everyone's just moving along this conveyor belt where racism happens around you, but and it's a question about what did you do when you actually see it. And so the conveyor belt is the world moves in one direction, but if you want to actually start combating racism, you start moving in the opposite direction. So you move along and you're eventually going to bump into people. And those bumps might be uncomfortable when they initially happen. And so the conveyor belt is like, all of these things are sort of like allegories that define stuff that we know already. This is about basically how it is that you change stuff. And it's hard because she doesn't actually give us like a good answer in the video. And we don't have, and I would argue that what you should leave this room with is how it is that you think about this conveyor belt. So if you're sort of moving along and, you know, the world kind of runs in a certain way, as you turn around and you start to, you know, call out, you start to, you know, go into spaces that, you know, where you're not the dominant individual, the dominant majority, or you go into spaces where, or you call out, you know, racist behavior or whatever it might be. These are uncomfortable things for individuals to do, but as you start to do that, you start to build the momentum of doing that. And so I guess it's one of those things that all I'd say is that it's a challenge to sort of think about in all the different ways that we arrive in this video, in this conversation today, how it is that you use, whether or not you're a student and you're going into a health profession, or whether or not you're an advisor or a professor or whoever you are, how it is that you actually interact on this conveyor belt. And so I don't have sort of a bunch of here's what it all means, but I would just, there's 2 minutes left. I'd stop talking and say, what do people think in terms of how it is that you leave this room and what it is that you do as your interaction with the world that tries to make these, ideas of Japanese lanterns, open close sign, gardener's tale, it's not going to get solved like that, but at the same time, how it is that you behave on a conveyor belt with that allegory is what it is that you should leave with, which we don't, well, I would argue, I don't have the answer to that.
And I don't think any of us have the answer, but as one thing she said, it says, if we want to set things right, we need to address the institutionalized racism. So in your sphere of influence, you can address that. You may not be able to address it at the presidential level or the state level or thing, but in your classroom, as a student, as a individual in those groups, you can bring it down to your level. And if we all make the changes, then it will, I believe it can filter up. Not just filter down, but it can filter up also. So
one last thing I'd also like to say is that an interesting thing for this group of folks is that we all are STEM educators, STEM students, so diversity is not something that we talk, I'm an evolutionary biologist. I talk about diversity a lot, but it's all about diversity of genes in populations that are not human populations. And so but it's critically important in the STEM fields to talk about diversity because our colleagues in arts and sciences over in humanities, in English and other departments do a fantastic job of talking about diversity because that's honestly their scholarship focuses on things that relate to diversity. And so it's a challenge, and I would just throw it out there that we need to do a better job, as STEM individuals and educators.
And I have a doctorate degree in veterinary medicine and a master's degree in public health. And when I was at Kansas State in the College of Veterinary Medicine, I was the only African American basically throughout the 4 years that I was there. So what I think we all need to do is create opportunities for people to have access to the same experiences that we have. And so now, once I graduated from the College of Veterinary Medicine, some opportunities were opened up, and there were 5 or 6 African-American females in the College of Veterinary Medicine. So we have to continue to make this progress towards equality and equal access. So with that being said, I hope that this was helpful to you and that you continue to learn and grow and think about these things. And we have another document that I'll email to you all that can be emailed out that just talks about changing the narrative, because there's certain ways we think, but sometimes we need to change the narrative, and it's very helpful. So thank you very much.
So thank you to everybody for attending today, and we did record this and we'll put this on the website, and then I'll also post the video for those that haven't seen it, and I'll post the document that he sends to me also. So thank you for coming, and thank you for speaking to us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.